The armorer's hands moved with practiced precision across the Hellfire missile's surface, her chalk sketching something that made Master Chief Warrant Officer Kane Rourke stop mid-stride. The symbol wasn't standard military marking. It was something else entirely. Something that made his blood run cold in the Afghan heat. Staff Sergeant Nix Castellanos didn't notice his reaction at first. She was too focused on the delicate work of arming the Ah-64 Apache, her weathered fingers tracing geometric patterns that seemed to shimmer in the desert sun. The other crew members had learned to ignore what they called her weird rituals, the strange markings she left on ordnance, the way she whispered to the aircraft like they were living things. But Rourke had seen that symbol before, in classified briefings, in folders marked with security clearances most people would never possess. Castellanos. His voice carried an edge that made her look up from the missile rack. Where did you learn to draw that? She followed his gaze to the chalk marking, a series of interlocking circles and lines that looked almost like a compass rose but wrong somehow. Asymmetrical, ancient. Just something I picked up, she said, her tone carefully neutral. Good luck charm. The lie hung in the air between them like cordite smoke. Rourke had flown 73 combat missions, had seen things that officially never happened, and he knew evasion when he heard it. But there was something in Castellanos' dark eyes, not fear exactly, but a kind of wary intelligence that made him reconsider his next words. The base around them hummed with pre-mission energy. Kandahar airfield stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of concrete and razor wire under the brutal Afghan sun. In 3 hours, Rourke would take the Apache up for what should have been a routine reconnaissance flight along the Pakistan border. Simple overwatch for a convoy moving through the Korangal Valley. Nothing that should require the kind of ordnance Castellanos was loading. But nothing about this deployment had been routine. For 6 weeks, they'd been losing aircraft to ground fire that shouldn't exist. Soviet-era surface-to-air missiles that had been appearing in Taliban hands with disturbing frequency. Intel suggested a new player in the region, someone with access to weapons that made experienced pilots wake up in cold sweats. Castellanos returned to her work, but her movements had changed, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. She began humming something under her breath, a melody that sounded like it belonged in a cathedral, not a war zone. Rourke found himself watching her hands instead of supervising the other ground crew. There was something hypnotic about the way she worked, as if she were conducting some kind of ceremony rather than simply loading high-explosive ordnance. When she finished with the Hellfires, she moved to the 30 chain gun, running her fingers along the ammunition belt with an almost tender precision. Staff Sergeant, Rourke said finally, we need to talk. She looked up again, and this time he was certain he saw something flicker behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. Yes, sir, after the mission. Before, the word came out harder than he intended. Now. The other crew members were pretending not to listen, but Rourke could feel their attention like a physical weight. In the distance, another Apache's rotors began to turn, the distinctive wop-wop-wop that had become the soundtrack to their war. But here, in the shadow of his aircraft, the world felt suddenly very quiet. Castellanos set down her tools and straightened to attention, but her eyes never left his face, and in them he saw something that made him wonder if he was the one who should be asking permission to speak. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of aviation fuel and something else, something that reminded him of incense and old prayers. When Castellanos spoke, her voice was steady but soft, like she was sharing a secret that could get them both killed. What do you want to know, sir? Everything, Rourke thought, but what he said was, start with the symbol. She glanced around the hangar, measuring distances and angles like she was calculating fields of fire. When she was satisfied they couldn't be overheard, she took a step closer. Close enough that he could see the small scar that ran along her left temple, close enough to notice that her dog tags weren't quite regulation. There was something else hanging with them, a small piece of metal that looked hand-forged. My grandmother used to draw it, she said finally. Said it was for protection, for bringing warriors home. Your grandmother drew classified intelligence symbols. The question surprised a laugh out of her, brief and bitter. Sir, with respect, your classified intelligence symbols are about 3,000 years older than your classification system. Rourke felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not literally but in the way that fundamental assumptions sometimes crumble without warning. He'd spent his entire adult life in the military, had learned to trust briefings and operational parameters and the clear lines of command structure. But standing here in the Afghan heat, looking at symbols that shouldn't exist and listening to an armorer talk about 3,000-year-old protection charms, he found himself wondering what else he didn't know. 3,000 years, he repeated. Give or take. Castellanos moved back to the Apache, running her hand along the aircraft's flank like she was gentling a nervous horse. The Apache understand. It's why they let me work on them. She said it so matter-of-factly that for a moment Rourke almost nodded along, as if military aircraft were capable of understanding anything beyond hydraulics and turboshaft engines and the physics of rotor lift. But then he caught himself. Castellanos, are you telling me you think these helicopters are alive? I'm telling you, sir, that metal remembers. She looked at him directly, and he saw that her eyes weren't just dark. They were the color of obsidian, black with flecks of gold that seemed to move in the light. Every round fired, every landing under fire, every pilot who trusted it to bring them home. Metal remembers, and sometimes it needs reminding of what it's supposed to do. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in tactics and enemy capabilities and mechanical systems, wanted to dismiss what she was saying as combat stress or cultural superstition or simple exhaustion. But there was another part, smaller and quieter, that remembered his first combat mission when the Apache had performed beyond its specifications, when systems that should have failed kept running, when luck had felt less like chance and more like intervention. Sir, Castellanos was watching him with something that might have been sympathy. You felt it too, haven't you? When everything goes wrong and the bird still brings you home. He had, God help him, he had. But admitting that felt like stepping across a line he couldn't uncross. Finish the pre-flight, he said instead. We launch in 2 hours. Yes, sir. But she didn't move immediately. Sir, when we're up there today, if things go sideways, trust the bird. It knows what it's doing. Then she turned back to her work, leaving Rourke standing alone with questions that felt dangerous to ask and more dangerous to leave unanswered. In the distance, the call to evening prayer drifted across the base, mixing with the sound of rotors and the eternal Afghan wind. He found himself wondering what his grandmother might have drawn, if she'd been the type to draw anything at all, and whether 3,000 years was really long enough for anything to be forgotten completely. The mission brief was straightforward, too straightforward, in Rourke's experience. Overwatch for a supply convoy moving through the Korangal Valley, a route they'd flown dozens of times before. The kind of routine patrol that should have been boring except for the 6 aircraft they'd lost in the past month and the growing sense that someone was hunting them with weapons that shouldn't exist. Captain Alina Voss stood at the front of the briefing room, her voice cutting through the air conditioning's hum as she outlined their flight path. She was career Army, a transport pilot who transitioned to attack helicopters with the kind of methodical competence that made her both respected and slightly feared. Her call sign was Precision, earned during her first deployment when she put a Hellfire missile through a window the size of a dinner plate. Intelligence indicates increased Taliban activity in the region, Voss continued, clicking to the next slide. But nothing that should concern a properly armed Apache crew. Rourke caught the emphasis on properly armed and glanced around the room. His crew was there. Staff Sergeant Castellanos sitting ramrod straight in the back row, Corporal Martinez who handled their electronics warfare suite, and Warrant Officer Thompson who served as their backup pilot. Good people, experienced people, the kind who came home from places that ate less experienced crews alive. But experience was a funny thing. It could save your life or get you killed, depending on whether you learned the right lessons. And lately, Rourke had been wondering what lessons they were supposed to be learning from aircraft that vanished without so much as a distress call. Questions? Voss asked. Rourke raised his hand. Ma'am, do we have any updated intelligence on the air defense systems we've been encountering? Something flickered across her face, irritation or maybe just fatigue. Negative. As far as official channels are concerned, the Taliban lack the capability to effectively engage our aircraft. With respect, ma'am, we've lost 6 birds in mechanical failures. Her voice carried the weight of an order. Equipment degradation due to environmental factors, pilot error in some cases. The room went very quiet. Everyone knew Lieutenant Colonel Hassan's Apache hadn't failed mechanically. They'd watched the gun camera footage, seen the missile trail that came from nowhere and turned $63 million of American technology into falling debris. Pilot error didn't explain the explosion that had lit up the night sky like a second sun. Any other questions? No one spoke. Dismissed, wheels up in 90 minutes. The crew filed out in the kind of silence that follows uncomfortable truths. Rourke lingered, ostensibly to review the mission parameters one more time, but really because he wanted to see if Captain Voss might say something off the record. Something that acknowledged what they all knew, that someone was out there with weapons that officially didn't exist, hunting American aircraft with disturbing success. She didn't, just gathered her papers and left without looking back. Castellanos was waiting for him in the corridor, her expression unreadable in the fluorescent lighting. Sir, walk with me. They moved through the base in the early evening heat, past the motor pool and the communications array, and the endless rows of prefabricated buildings that made every forward operating base look the same. The air smelled of diesel fuel and dust, and something else. Something organic and ancient that reminded Rourke of his childhood visits to his grandfather's farm. You wanted to ask Captain Voss something else, Castellanos said finally. It wasn't a question, how did you? Your jaw gets tight when you're holding back words. Same tell you have when you're on approach and something doesn't feel right. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. You've been watching me that closely. I watch everyone that closely, keeps people alive. She paused beside a concrete barrier, looking out at the mountains that ringed the airfield. What were you going to ask? Rourke found himself studying her profile in the fading light. Staff Sergeant Nix Castellanos, 28 years old according to her personnel file, originally from New Mexico. 2 deployments in Iraq, 1 previous tour in Afghanistan. Commendations for technical excellence and what her officers called innovative problem-solving. No disciplinary actions, no red flags, nothing to suggest she was anything other than a competent armorer with an unusual approach to her work. But personnel files didn't capture everything. They didn't mention the way other crew members sought her out before difficult missions, or how aircraft seemed to perform better after she'd worked on them, or the fact that she'd been present for the maintenance of every Apache that had come home when it shouldn't have. I was going to ask if she'd ever seen weapons like the ones we're facing, he said finally. And she would have told you that officially, we're not facing any weapons. But unofficially, Castellanos turned to face him, and in the dying light her eyes looked almost black. Unofficially, someone's been selling very old things to very angry people, things that were buried for good reasons. The word sent a chill down his spine despite the heat. What kind of things? The kind your briefings don't have names for. She looked back at the mountains, where the first stars were beginning to appear. My grandmother used to tell stories about weapons that could reach up and pull eagles from the sky. Said they were made by people who understood that metal and flesh weren't as different as most folks thought. Castellanos, are you trying to tell me we're facing some kind of ancient technology? I'm trying to tell you, sir, that ancient doesn't mean primitive, and that the people who made those symbols I draw knew things about warfare that didn't make it into your field manuals. The conversation was spiraling into territory that made his tactical training recoil. Ancient weapons, mystical symbols, aircraft that understood human emotions. Every part of his professional experience said this was either elaborate psychological manipulation or combat stress expressing itself in unusually creative ways. But another part, the part that had kept him alive through 73 missions, was listening very carefully. What would your grandmother say about tomorrow's mission? Castellanos was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She'd say the sky remembers everything that falls from it, and that sometimes, when enough eagles have fallen, the sky gets angry. The flight line before dawn was a cathedral of shadows and mechanical prayer. Rourke arrived to find Castellanos already at work, her movements fluid and purposeful in the pre-mission darkness. She'd painted something new on the Apache's nose, not the regulation unit insignia, but something that looked like wind patterns or maybe the impression left by lightning and sand. "Morning, Staff Sergeant." "Morning, sir." She didn't look up from whatever final adjustments she was making to the targeting system. "Birds ready when you are." The Apache crouched in the hangar like a sleeping predator, all angles and weaponry, and barely contained mechanical violence. AH-64D longbow, serial number 94000275, manufactured in Mesa, Arizona, and shipped to Afghanistan to hunt Taliban fighters in mountains that had swallowed armies for thousands of years. Standard armament: one M230 chain gun, 4 Hellfire missiles, 2 rocket pods loaded with 2.75-inch folding-fin aerial rockets. Nothing standard about the way it felt this morning. Rourke began his pre-flight inspection, running through the checklist that had become as automatic as breathing. Rotor head and swashplate, engine intakes, landing gear, weapons pylons, everything exactly as it should be. But when he ran his hand along the fuselage, the metal felt warm not from the sun, which hadn't risen yet, but from something internal, something that made his palm tingle like he'd touched a live wire. "Castellanos." "Sorry." "The bird feel different to you this morning." She straightened from her work and looked at him with those obsidian eyes. "Every mission feels different, sir. Question is whether you're paying attention to what it's trying to tell you." "And what's it trying to tell me?" "That today's the day you stop pretending luck is random." Warrant Officer Thompson arrived with coffee and the kind of gallows humor that preceded dangerous missions. "Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Beautiful day to get shot at by weapons that don't exist." "Knock it off, Thompson," Rourke said automatically, but without heat. Everyone dealt with pre-mission nerves differently. Some people got quiet, some got talkative, some developed an obsession with checking and rechecking equipment. Thompson made jokes that weren't quite funny enough to laugh at. "Sir, you see the intel update." Thompson held out a folder marked with the day's classification stamps. "Apparently we're now cleared to engage any surface-to-air threats with extreme prejudice." Rourke scanned the document. The language was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. Someone higher up the chain of command had finally acknowledged that they were facing organized air defense systems, the kind that required different tactics than the improvised explosive devices and small arms fire that had defined the early years of the war. "About time," he muttered. "Sir," Castellanos appeared beside him, her voice carrying an odd note. "Mind if I ask what altitude you're planning to maintain?" The question was routine. Armorers needed to understand flight profiles to properly configure weapons systems. But something in her tone made him look up from the briefing folder. "Standard Overwatch altitude, 4,000 feet AGL, give or take." She nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Sir, respectfully suggest we stay higher today, maybe 6,000. "Any particular reason?" Metal remembers, sir, and today it's remembering things that reach up. Thompson snorted. Castellanos, with respect, you can't possibly know that from working on the weapons systems. Can I? She looked at him with something that might have been pity. Warrant Officer Thompson, how many times have you flown missions where everything went exactly according to plan? None, he admitted, but that doesn't mean. And how many times has the equipment performed beyond its rated specifications when your life depended on it? Thompson's expression changed. Everyone in the unit had stories about impossible saves, about systems that should have failed but didn't, about aircraft that somehow found their way home through mechanical problems that should have been catastrophic. That's just good maintenance and... Good maintenance and what? Luck. Castellanos moved to the Apache's side and placed her palm flat against the fuselage. This bird has been shot, overloaded, pushed past every operational limit in the manual, and it's still here, still flying, still bringing people home. You think that's an accident? The conversation was heading into territory that made Rourke uncomfortable, but he found himself reluctant to shut it down. There was something in Castellanos' voice, not mysticism or superstition, but the kind of practical knowledge that came from years of working with complex systems under extreme conditions. What are you suggesting, Staff Sergeant? I'm suggesting, sir, that there's more than one way to think about the relationship between pilot and aircraft, and that maybe, sometimes, it pays to listen when the bird tries to tell you something. The hangar fell quiet except for the distant sound of other crews preparing for the day's missions. In an hour, the sun would rise over the Afghan mountains, and they would lift off into air that had claimed 6 American aircraft in the past month. They would fly overwatch for a convoy that might or might not encounter enemy forces, using weapons that might or might not be sufficient for whatever they faced. And somewhere out there, someone with access to weapons that officially didn't exist would be watching the sky, waiting for American helicopters to come within range. Rourke found himself thinking about his grandfather, who'd flown P-51 Mustangs over Germany and never talked about the war except to say that some aircraft had souls and some didn't. He'd thought it was just old man talk until now. 6,000 feet, he said finally. We'll maintain 6,000. Castellanos smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the conversation began. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when we're back on the ground. But as he turned to continue the pre-flight inspection, Rourke caught sight of something that stopped him cold. There, painted in small letters along the Apache's rotor hub, was a name he didn't recognize. Tlaxolteotl. Castellanos, what's that word on the rotor hub? She followed his gaze, and for a moment her composed expression cracked, revealing something vulnerable underneath. It's what I call her, sir, the bird. What does it mean? She hesitated, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. It's Nahuatl, an old name for someone who ate sins, someone who took the darkness out of warriors so they could find their way home. The explanation should have sounded like nonsense, should have prompted a lecture about unauthorized modifications to military equipment and the importance of maintaining professional standards. Instead, Rourke found himself nodding as if it made perfect sense. Your grandmother teach you that too? Yes, sir. Along with the symbols and the prayers and the understanding that some fights are older than the people fighting them. Thompson cleared his throat uncomfortably. Sir, not to interrupt, but we've got 15 minutes to first light. Rourke glanced at his watch. The other pilot was right. They needed to focus on the mission parameters, not ancient names and mystical explanations for mechanical reliability. But as he climbed into the Apache's cockpit, he found himself whispering the name under his breath. Tlaxolteotl, the one who ate sins. The Apache's turboshaft engines spun up with their familiar whine, and for the first time in weeks, the sound didn't fill him with dread. Instead, it sounded almost like welcome, like recognition. like something that remembered how to bring warriors home. The flight to the Korangal Valley took 43 minutes through air that tasted of ancient dust and modern warfare. Rourke held them at 6,000 feet despite Thompson's repeated suggestions that they descend for better visibility. The convoy below looked like toys from their altitude, 8 vehicles moving in tactical formation through terrain that had been claiming soldiers since Alexander the Great. "Overlord, this is Reaper 6-1. On station and monitoring," Rourke transmitted to the forward operating base. "Copy, Reaper 6-1. Convoy reports all quiet. Maintain overwatch posture." Standard radio protocol for a routine mission. Nothing in the transmission suggested that anything was different about today. But Castellanos had been right about one thing: the Apache felt different. More responsive, maybe, or more attuned to his inputs. When he adjusted course to follow the convoy's path, the aircraft seemed to anticipate his intentions. "Sir," Thompson's voice came through the intercom, carefully professional. "I'm picking up some unusual electromagnetic signatures. Nothing on standard frequencies, but—" "But what?" "Well, sir, if I didn't know better, I'd say someone was painting us with targeting radar." Rourke felt his stomach clench. Targeting radar meant surface-to-air missiles, and surface-to-air missiles meant that someone down there had weapons sophisticated enough to reach them at 6,000 feet. He began evasive maneuvers, nothing dramatic, just enough deviation from straight flight to complicate any potential targeting solution. "Can you get a bearing on the source?" "Negative, sir. It's like the signals coming from multiple directions, almost like they're networked." That was bad news. Individual missile sites could be avoided or suppressed with careful tactics. Networked air defense systems were exponentially more dangerous, capable of coordinating fires and sharing targeting data in ways that made evasion nearly impossible. "Overlord, Reaper 6-1. Request immediate tactical intelligence update. We're detecting possible surface-to-air threats in our operational area." The response took longer than it should have. "Reaper 6-1, Overlord. No surface-to-air threats identified by current intelligence. Continue mission as briefed." Rourke exchanged glances with Thompson. They both knew what they were detecting, and they both knew it represented a threat to their aircraft. But official intelligence said the threat didn't exist, which left them in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between their instruments and their orders. "Sir," Thompson said quietly, "what do you want to do?" Before Rourke could answer, the radio crackled with a new voice, convoy commander calling in trouble. Any station, this is Prairie Dog 6. We are taking effective fire from multiple directions. Grid coordinates to follow." The attack was professionally executed. Small arms fire from elevated positions, designed to channel the convoy into a kill zone where heavier weapons could engage. Classic Taliban tactics, but with a level of coordination that suggested extensive planning and reconnaissance. "Prairie Dog 6, this is Reaper 6-1. We have eyes on your position. Where do you need fires?" "Reaper 6-1, we've got shooters in the tree line at—" The transmission cut off in a burst of static. Thompson was already working to re-establish contact when Castellanos' voice came through the intercom. She'd remained silent during the flight, monitoring her systems and weapons, but now she sounded urgent. "Sir, recommend immediate descent to engagement altitude. The bird's telling me something's coming." "What do you mean, something's coming?" "Missile launch, sir. Multiple launches, 6 o'clock low." Rourke threw the Apache into evasive maneuvers before he consciously processed what she'd said. The aircraft responded instantly, dropping altitude and changing heading with a violence that pressed him into his seat. Behind him, he could hear Thompson calling out radar contacts and trying to get a lock on whatever was targeting them. And then he saw them. White smoke trails rising from the mountains like deadly flowers, tracking toward their position with the relentless mathematics of guided munitions. Holy shit, Thompson breathed. Sir, I count 4 missiles inbound. SA-24 Grinch by the signature. SA-24 Grinch. Soviet-designed, shoulder-fired, infrared-guided, capable of engaging targets up to 11,000 feet at ranges exceeding 3 miles. Sophisticated enough to defeat most countermeasures, and definitely not the kind of weapon Taliban fighters should have access to. Dispensing chaff and flares, Rourke announced, triggering the countermeasures suite. The Apache shuddered as dozens of aluminum strips and magnesium flares ejected from pods along its fuselage, creating a cloud of confusion designed to fool infrared and radar-guided seekers. 2 of the missiles went for the decoys. The other 2 kept tracking. Still got 2 inbound, Thompson called. Time to impact 12 seconds. Rourke pushed the Apache into a diving turn, trading altitude for airspeed, and hopping that the missile's seeker heads couldn't keep up with the angular velocity. The aircraft groaned under the G-forces, metal flexing in ways it wasn't designed for. But instead of breaking apart, it seemed to settle into the maneuver like it had been waiting for this moment. 8 seconds. The mountains rushed up toward them, brown and hostile and utterly indifferent to American technology and tactical training. At this altitude, there was no margin for error, no room for mechanical failure or pilot error or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong when sophisticated weapons tried to kill each other in 3 dimensions. 4 seconds. Hang on, Rourke muttered, and pulled the Apache into a climb that should have been impossible at their current airspeed. The aircraft responded like it had been shot from a cannon, engines screaming as rotor blades bit into air so thin it shouldn't have provided enough lift. The first missile shot past their tail, its proximity fuse triggered too late by the sudden change in flight path. The second one detonated close enough to pepper their fuselage with shrapnel, but not close enough to bring them down. Jesus Christ, Thompson said shakily. How the hell did we just do that? Rourke was wondering the same thing. The maneuver he just executed should have resulted in rotor stall and an unrecoverable crash into the mountainside. Instead, they were climbing through 8,000 feet with all systems operational, and what sounded like Castellanos humming softly over the intercom. Reaper 6-1, Prairie Dog 6. Thank God you're still there. We need immediate close air support. Grid coordinates 41 Sierra, Quebec 45 21 68 47. Rourke checked his system's display. Weapons green, targeting system operational, enough ordnance to engage multiple ground targets. But the missile attack had come from positions that weren't supposed to exist, using weapons that Taliban fighters weren't supposed to possess. Prairie Dog 6, Reaper 6-1. Be advised, we just engaged surface-to-air missiles in your area. Recommend you alter your route immediately. Negative, Reaper 6-1. We've got wounded and we're pinned down. We need you to clear those positions. It was the kind of request that defined military service, soldiers on the ground taking fire, depending on air power to even the odds. The kind of situation where doctrine was clear and hesitation could mean the difference between Americans going home and Americans going into body bags. But doctrine didn't account for air defense systems that shouldn't exist, operated by people who weren't supposed to have them. Sir, Castellanos' voice came through the intercom, calm and steady. The bird knows where they are. What? The missile sights. She can feel them. Metal recognizes metal even when it's trying to hide. Rourke looked at his targeting display. Nothing but empty mountain slopes and terrain features that looked identical to 1,000 other ridgelines in Afghanistan. But as he watched, small symbols began appearing on the screen, not generated by radar or electro-optical sensors, but somehow just there, marking positions that his rational mind insisted couldn't be detected by any known means. Thompson, you seeing this? Sir, I'm not sure what I'm seeing. The targeting computer is showing contacts that aren't registering on any of our sensors. The symbols pulsed gently on the display, marking 3 positions in a rough triangle around the convoy's location, perfectly positioned for overlapping fields of fire, exactly where professional military planners would place surface-to-air missile sites to create an effective engagement zone. Castellanos, how is the targeting computer showing contacts we can't detect? Because she remembers, sir. Metal remembers metal, and every weapon has a signature that goes deeper than electromagnetic emissions. It was impossible. It violated everything Rourke knew about sensor technology and target acquisition and the basic physics of detection systems. But the symbols were there, marking positions that perfectly matched the tactics he would use if he were trying to ambush American helicopters. Prairie Dog 6, Reaper 6-1. I have possible missile sites marked, engaging with Hellfire. Copy Reaper 6-1, cleared hot. Rourke selected the first target and waited for the targeting system to achieve lock. The process should have taken several seconds, time for the laser designator to paint the target, for the missile seeker head to acquire the reflected energy, for the fire control computer to calculate trajectory and impact probability. Instead, the tone sounded immediately. Lock acquired, firing solution computed, weapon ready to launch. Fox 3, Rourke announced, triggering the first Hellfire missile. The weapon separated from its pylon with a sound like tearing canvas, its rocket motor igniting as it streaked toward a target that shouldn't have been visible to their sensors. Rourke was already shifting to the second target when the first missile impacted, detonating in a brilliant flash that revealed the skeletal remains of what looked like a sophisticated missile launcher. Direct hit, Thompson called. Jesus, sir, there was actually something there. The second and third Hellfire missiles found their targets with the same impossible precision, each detonation revealing equipment that hadn't been visible moments before. Advanced surface-to-air missile systems that belonged in the arsenals of nation-states, not insurgent groups operating from mountain caves. Reaper 6-1, Prairie Dog 6. Outstanding work. Fires have ceased. We're moving to casualty evacuation point. Copy Prairie Dog 6. We'll maintain overwatch until you're clear. But as Rourke settled into a slow orbit above the convoy, he found himself staring at his targeting display with something approaching awe. The symbols were still there, not fading as sensor contacts normally did, but maintaining their steady presence like permanent features of the electronic landscape. Castellanos. Sir, how long have you been able to do this? The intercom was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the cockpit walls. Since I was 8 years old, sir. Since my grandmother taught me that metal remembers everything it's ever been used for. The flight back to Kandahar passed in contemplative silence, each crew member processing what they'd experienced in their own way. Rourke found himself running through the mission parameters over and over, trying to find a rational explanation for targeting contacts that shouldn't have existed and weapons performance that exceeded every specification in the technical manuals. Thompson maintained radio contact with the convoy until they reached friendly lines, his voice carrying the professional satisfaction that came from a successful close air support mission. But Rourke could hear the questions underneath. The same questions he was asking himself about sensors that detected invisible targets and aircraft that performed impossible maneuvers. Castellanos remained quiet, monitoring her systems and weapons status with the same methodical attention she'd shown during the pre-flight inspection. But occasionally, Rourke caught her humming that strange melody, something that sounded like a lullaby or maybe a prayer. As they approached Kandahar Airfield, the familiar sight of concrete and razor wire should have felt like safety. Instead, it felt like returning to a world where the rules were different, where aircraft were machines and weapons were tools, and the connection between pilot and bird was nothing more than training and mechanical interface. Kandahar Tower, Reaper 6-1 requesting approach. Reaper 6-1 Kandahar Tower, you're cleared direct to the ramp. Welcome home. Home. The word carried implications that Rourke wasn't sure applied to this place, or to the war they were fighting, or to the questions that were multiplying faster than he could find answers. But as the Apache settled onto the flight line with the gentle precision that marked a successful mission, he found himself grateful for the solid feel of Earth beneath them. "Engines shutting down," he announced, beginning the post-flight checklist that would secure the aircraft for maintenance and inspection. "Sir," Castellanos' voice came through the intercom one last time. "Thank you for listening to the bird today. Thank you for knowing what to listen for." The engines wound down with their characteristic whine, rotor blades gradually slowing until the Apache sat silent in the Afghan heat. But even with the power off, the aircraft felt somehow alert, not sleeping exactly, but resting, waiting for the next mission, the next chance to prove that some partnerships went deeper.